In Matthew 27, we read, "At that time, 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, 'You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross.' In the same way, the chief priests also, coming with the scribes and the elders, were mocking him and saying, 'He saved others. He cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now, if he delights in him, for he said, I am the Son of God.' The robbers who had been crucified with him were also insulting him with the same words." In Luke 23, we read, "One of the criminals who were hanging there was hurling abuse at him, saying, 'Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us.' But the other answered and rebuked him and said, 'Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong.' And he was saying, 'Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom.' And he said to him, 'Truly, I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise.' It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, because the sun was obscured, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' Having said this, he breathed his last." What you're about to see is a dramatic interpretation of the life of one of the thieves who was crucified along with Jesus. Most of what is presented is based on the chapter entitled Remember Me in the book Loving God by Chuck Colson. The material presented is based on the texts of the Bible, though the first part of the story is added to help us understand what his life might have been like before he's introduced in the biblical narrative. So we give you a voice from beyond the grave. Shalom. I greet you in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Christ. My name is Judah ben Josiah. I was born on the island of Cyprus. I was born a slave. My father, Josiah, was a slave before me. His father had been captive in one of Rome's campaigns in the Promised Land. When my father was a young man, he was sold to a Roman centurion who had a home on the island of Cyprus. And so I was born on Cyprus, and both my parents were slaves. Now, though I grew up as a slave, my life wasn't bad. In fact, it was quite pleasant. My best friend was Demetrius, my master's son. And he and I used to run and chase one another. We would chase the sheep and the goats. We would climb trees. We'd throw fruit at other kids. We had a wonderful time growing up. My father taught me to read from the law and from the prophets. But as we got older, I began to see a difference between Demetrius and me. Demetrius would be taken away for a few hours every day to study with a tutor. And this tutor would teach him mathematics and philosophy, and he would learn to read and to write. And while he did that, I would be out in the fields with my father working, and I began to develop some resentment as a result of that. My father noticed that, and he would talk to me about it, but I still couldn't shake that bitterness within my heart. As I got older, I started blaming others for almost everything I experienced. When my mother died after a prolonged illness, I blamed my master for it, even though he had his doctor visit her on a number of occasions. One day while working in the field, my father complained of a headache and he fell down. I ran to him, but by the time I got there, his eyes were closed. I would never see those eyes opened again. And though my master extended his condolences to me, I still blamed him for my father's death. Those were hard times, but those weren't the hardest times that I went through. The hardest day for me was the day when my master died. You may ask, how could that be harder than when your parents died? It was a harder day for me because that day Demetrius, my best friend, became my master. And the bitterness within me made me swear that I would escape or I would die as I tried to escape. Demetrius, however, still favored me. And he talked to me about some of the female servants that he had. He told me just to pick one to be my wife. I didn't want to marry because I didn't want to get close to anybody. I didn't want to become attached to anyone because I knew I was going to escape at some point. A few months later, Demetrius sent me to a port city. He had bought some slaves and I had been sent with a wagon to bring those slaves in. And I knew that would be the day that I would escape. And so I took the money, got the horses, took the wagon. As I went into that town, I found a buyer for the horses and for the cart. I lied about who I was and I bought passage on a vessel that was headed to the city of Tyre. By the time that they missed me and started looking for me, I would be long gone. I would have found my way into Jerusalem, and there was no way they were going to find me in that city. When I got to Tyre, I found a caravan heading toward Jerusalem. It was getting close to the Passover time, and so there were pilgrims everywhere. It was pretty easy to travel with them, and it was pretty easy to find food among them. When I arrived in Jerusalem, I couldn't believe the number of people who were there. It's the most people I had ever seen in my entire life. I wanted to see the temple that my father told me about time and time again, though he had never seen it. All he could tell me about it was what from his father told him and what he had read about. And so when I got there, it was an amazing structure, the most amazing building I had ever seen in my life. But I didn't want to stay there too long because right next to it was where the Roman legion was headquartered. And I didn't want to be around them too much. I made my way through and I found a place to stay, and then I started looking for work, which was pretty hard to find. I didn't have much money at this point. I spent much of what I had already gotten. And so I started looking for ways to provide for myself. I ended up staying in a field outside the city in tents. And because there were lots of people there, I could steal food every once in a while from different places. A few days after doing this, a man approached me and he told me that he had been watching me. I thought he was going to call the Romans, and he told me not to worry, that he actually had work for me. He wanted me to be a lookout for him and some others who were involved in a gang. And so I'd found work. One thing led to another, and pretty soon I started stealing with them. I was working my way up into the gang, and merchants all around us began to fear us because we protected them from others, but in protecting them, they had to keep providing for us. I did this for about 2 years. Then one day, just before Passover came back around, we were robbing a person when soldiers came around the corner. We tried to run away, but we were caught. You know, I've never killed anybody before, but when I was captured, I swore if I ever found the guy who was supposed to be our lookout, I would kill him. For all I know, the rest of the gang had already done that. I was placed in a crowded cell with a bunch of other prisoners. I was there only one day, and then I was taken before Pilate, the governor of Judea. I was found guilty without much of a trial, and I was sentenced to death. I couldn't believe it. I was taken to a different cell, and there were only 2 other prisoners in this cell, and each of them was chained to a guard. The place just stunk. There was the smell of urine everywhere. And the guards were young. They weren't happy about being there. They hated this assignment. As I walked in, one of the guards looked up and he said, "Well, I guess there'll be 3 of them this time instead of 2 on the Passover." It began to sink in. I was actually going to be executed, and it was going to be really soon. I didn't want to die. I couldn't believe that I was going to be executed. There had to be some mistake here. I hadn't killed anyone, and yet the more I quarreled, the more I was mocked and the more I was beaten by the guards. There was another prisoner there named Jacob. And Jacob looked old, but he was only about 10 years older than I was. The third prisoner in there was a fairly well-known name. His name was Barabbas. He was a leader of insurrectionist group. And there were a bunch of freedom fighters, as they referred to themselves. And he was celebrated among the various gangs. I knew him just by name. There was one small window in the cell, and Barabbas was standing beside it, and he was listening intently. I asked Jacob what he heard, but at first he didn't reply. He just shrugged his shoulders. Maybe he's listening for the rescue squad to come in and free us and make him king of Jerusalem. Jacob said that with a lot of sarcasm. If they come, I'll fight. I've always been a fighter. I can't help but feel this is the end of the line for me. So I asked him, "You're not afraid?" He goes, "Of course I'm afraid, but I don't want to die. But do you know a way out of here? Do you have people coming to free you?" I've had my moments before, and now it's their time. You know, after a time of silence, I spoke again. "Sounds like there's a whole big crowd out there." The soldier said, "Of course it's a crowd. It's a Jewish Passover tomorrow, and you're going to give them a great show. You 3 will be the highlight of the feast, at least for us Romans." You know, I listened to those soldiers talk about their families, how they hated this duty. I finally looked over and asked Jacob, "Are you sorry for anything?" Jacob said, "Sure, I'm sorry I got caught." No, I mean, do you have any regrets? Regrets for what? That you didn't live a more normal life, a more righteous life? You robbed, you lied, I'm assuming you killed. Do you have any regrets for any of that? "What about you?" he said. "Do you have any?" Well, I've never killed anybody. I stole to live because no one would hire me. Look at how thin I am. A man has to eat. Not if he's dead. "What were you, a slave?" "I used to be, but never again." "Sure, I know your story. Your master was cruel and you ran away. From where?" "Cyprus," I said. "So let me see. You stole from your master. You ran away, you ended up in Jerusalem, somebody saw you and said, 'Hey, listen, I've got a job for you. You can be a lookout for us.' And pretty soon you were robbing people and you were involved in a gang." And I didn't even know how to answer as he said that because everything he said was so accurate. You know, soon the cell door opened and 2 soldiers were standing there, and they called Barabbas' name. He didn't answer. His guard pointed to him at the window, and so he said, "Well, we're here to rescue you, ha ha." And they took him outside, and they said, "We're going to help you get to another world." And they took him out there, and they began to beat him. You could hear as they were lashing him, and he was screaming, he was cursing. Finally brought him in, he was covered in blood. They grabbed Jacob. And as they did, Jacob said to me, "Pray that they beat you well. You'll die much quicker and it'll be a whole lot easier." I counted that whip 20 some odd times, and then they brought Jacob in. He tried to kick one of the guards, who ended up kicking him in return. And the guard was going to try to kill him when the commander said, "Leave him alone. He wants you to kill him. He wants the easy way out. We've got better plans for him tomorrow. And so they dragged me last of all. I've never, ever felt so much pain in all my life. I cried, I yelled, I cursed, I screamed. All I eventually could do is just whimper. I passed out during the beating. When I woke up, I was back in my cell, and my face flat on the cell floor. Light was beginning to come in through the window as morning was beginning to dawn. As my senses started coming back to me, I saw the others were all huddled near the window. There was a crowd, and it seemed strange that there would be a crowd so early in the morning. We really couldn't hear a whole lot of what was happening. It was just commotion out there until all of a sudden, in unison, you heard the entire crowd cry, "Barabbas! Barabbas!" And then it got quiet. And then you could hear everybody in unison say, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And we started putting the whole thing together. Barabbas! Barabbas! Crucify him! Crucify him! And we knew what was going to happen. A few minutes later, the door opened. Some soldiers walked in and asked for Barabbas. When the guard pointed which one was Barabbas, they told him, "Barabbas, this is your lucky day. You're free." And Barabbas didn't even move. The soldier said, "Barabbas, you're free." He said, "Don't tempt me with your cruelty." And the soldier said, "This isn't a temptation. Pilate has pardoned you. You're to go free." He didn't move. He didn't know what to do. Soldier then said, "They're going to crucify Jesus the rabbi in your place." Pilate offered them Jesus, and they chose you. I don't ever want to see you again. You and all your Jewish friends just make me sick. Just leave. Get out of my sight. And so Barabbas, as he was unchained, just slowly walked to the door and then ran out the door as fast as he could. I was thinking maybe that's true for us as well. But it didn't seem that way. He said, "All right, let's go." There were people everywhere. They were cursing, they were mocking, they were spitting, they were jeering. And the amazing thing was, all their curses and their jeers weren't toward me or toward Jacob. They were toward this rabbi. When I finally got a look at him, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. You could barely tell there was a face where his face should have been. He had been beaten so bad. His back looked like it had been shredded through the whipping that he had received. His face was just caked with blood. But then our eyes met as I looked at him. I really can't explain to you what I saw when I looked into that rabbi's eyes. It's as though he was looking right into me. And for the first time, I just didn't know what to do. There was a look of peace in his eyes in the midst of everything that he was going through that I couldn't explain. As we walked to the place where we were to be crucified, he fell down a number of times. One of the soldiers, who was very impatient, eventually pulled a man from the crowd and had him carry the cross for Jesus. As we walked, I kept thinking, this is the last street I'll ever see. These are the last crowds I'll ever hear. These are the last steps I'll ever take. I didn't want to die. But I wasn't getting any sympathetic anything from anyone. They were just mocking us all the way through. And I was thinking, they're even worse than I am. When we got to Golgotha, the place where we're to be crucified, they gave us something to drink. What is it? I asked. It's wine with myrrh to dull the pain. I drank it as greedily as I could until it was pulled away from me. And then they gave some to Jacob. Jesus, when he was offered the cup, wouldn't take it. So Jacob finished it off. We were stripped naked. The soldiers fought over Jesus' clothes. The centurion told them not to tear his tunic, but they would divide things later. You know, a soldier stretched my arms as far as it could go. I heard the loudest, most painful scream I'd ever heard in my life. It was Jacob as a spike went through his hand, and before I could even process it any further, my voice joined his as a spike went through my hand. I writhed in pain as it pinned me to the cross. There was this burning pain of fire within me. Soldiers grabbed my legs and they bent them slightly, and I screamed before they drove a spike through them. I ended up throwing up all over the soldier who was in front of me, and then I passed out from the pain. But that pain that caused me to pass out also brought me back again. And it just kept going from consciousness to unconsciousness, time and time again. Yet it was incredible during that time because I could still think, I could still hear, I could still see. There was a large crowd around us. They were ignoring me. Once again, their whole focus was on Jesus. As they nailed Jesus to the cross, he didn't resist. It's as though he invited those nails. They nailed a sign above him that said, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Then I did something I hadn't done since I was a child. I earnestly talked to God. I begged him to help me. I had ignored God for decades. But it was too convicting to talk to him. But now, in my last moment, felt like I should talk to him in some way. Started trying to think of passages that my father had read to me from the Holy Book, a book I had ignored for most of my life. As I hung there dying, I thought of them again. I wanted to be free. I looked over at Jesus and began to talk to him as I'd heard the priests and others do. I told him to save himself, to come down from the cross. I was afraid to die. So I looked at him again and wondered again, why is he here? A religious leader came to the foot of the cross and said to Jesus, "Why do you stay there? If you're the Son of God, come down and we'll worship you. We'll believe in you." A soldier laughed at that moment, and the priest spoke to the soldier, probably for the first time in his entire life. Typical, isn't it? He saved others. He can't save himself. Says he's the King of Israel. Says he's the Son of God. If he's the Son of God, why doesn't God come and rescue his own Son? I wondered, did Jesus really say that? Did he say that he was the Son of God? You know, I'd heard the commotion he had created earlier when he rode into Jerusalem, but even Barabbas didn't claim to be the Son of God. I looked toward him and said, "If you're the Son of God, why not curse these mockers and set yourself and us free?" Jesus was in pain, and he finally opened his mouth to speak. I heard him clearly, being only a few feet away from him. You know, I expected him to rain down curses on those soldiers and those who were there mocking him. But he simply said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." I stared at Jesus. Forgive them? How can you say that? But more than that, just hearing the word Father as he spoke to God caught me by surprise. He claimed to be the Son of God, they say. Here he is. He speaks to God as though God were his own Father. Is it possible that the Son of God could be here, dying on a cross next to me? How can that be? And why? If he's crazy, they'd simply ignore him. But he's not being ignored. Not by the religious leaders and not by the Romans. As I looked toward Jesus, he lifted his head and looked right into my eyes. As I looked at his eyes, I was struck by the innocence and the wisdom they showed. For the first time today, I felt naked as I looked into those innocent eyes. I wanted to look away because of the shame, but his eyes were so inviting I couldn't turn away from him. You know, I'd seen wise men before, but they're hardly innocent. They learn wisdom by their mistakes and their cruelty and the cruelty of life. He seemed wise, but he also seemed innocent. You know, I'd known a lot of innocent people, but they were naive because they lacked wisdom. They were like little children. Eventually, I turned my eyes away because I just couldn't hold Jesus' stare. Because it looked like he was looking right into my soul. In that moment, I saw the ugliness, I saw the bitterness, I saw the hatred, all of that was within me. All because I looked into those innocent eyes, which looked at me and then looked into me. I thought of his words of forgiveness, and I felt incredible shame for the life that I had lived, the lies I had told, the things I had stolen, the God I had offended. I sensed the nakedness and the wickedness of my own soul before those searching eyes of Jesus. I heard the voice of the soldiers as they talked at the foot of the cross, and then I heard a familiar voice. That was a lot weaker. It was a voice of Jacob. He was speaking with anger toward Jesus. Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us. Though he was near death, Jacob's anger had not died. It was inflamed. If Jesus would not go out cursing, he would, and he did. His anger turned on one as helpless as himself. At that point, the dam in me broke. Jacob and I deserved to be here, but Jesus did not. He had done nothing wrong. With all my power, I spoke up. Don't you even fear God? We're under the same sentence. You and I deserve to be here. But this man, he's done nothing wrong. The soldiers looked up as I spoke. The priests stopped their talking and stared at me. Jesus looked at me with those loving eyes. Though my heart screamed and shouted, it only came out as a whisper. Jesus, remember me. Remember me when you come in your kingdom. It was as though he's been waiting for me. One final sheep to come scraggling into the fold. And Jesus replied, I tell you the truth, today you'll be with me in paradise. Those words brought me comfort. But I wasn't the only one who was comforted as he died on the cross. I heard him speak to his mother and a young man with her. As a good son, he provided someone to care for her after he was gone. Later I heard him shout, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I must be dying, I told myself. It started getting dark all around me. Soon I realized I wasn't dead yet. It actually was getting dark all around me. The sun disappeared in the middle of the day. It became deathly quiet, even among the soldiers. I could see their bewilderment as they looked around. In that quiet, I was alone with my pain and my thoughts. Jesus was dying. How could he save me? Yet he said I would be with him in paradise this day. Maybe his kingdom was not of this world, but of another world. A world I had stopped thinking about years ago. In that moment, Jesus' voice pierced the quiet with one word, tetelestai. It is finished. It had been paid in full. It's as though he wanted all to know that the job he had come to do was done. And then he just very simply and quietly said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And he laid down his life at that point. It really seemed to me like he personally laid it down on his own. It's not as though they took it from him. He was ready at that point. At that time, the darkness got even darker. The ground began to shake. Women and men cried out in fear. Some stumbled and fell. Many people began to flee away. The Roman centurion at the foot of the cross looked up at Jesus and said, "Truly, this man was innocent. Truly, this man was the Son of God." Now I was utterly alone, without anything to hold on to other than the words of Jesus and an example of how one should die. I had heard his final words. I now knew how to die. The priest wanted to end this before the end of the day, before the end of the Sabbath. And so a soldier came with a big axe, and with the blunt end of it, he hit Jacob on his shins to break his legs. Jacob just barely whimpered. As the soldier was walking toward me, I looked down at him. He raised his axe. I closed my eyes and I simply whispered, "Jesus, into your hands I commit my spirit." That was a powerful, powerful story to think about. It ends with the death of the thief on the cross as well as the death of Jesus Christ. But praise God, the story does not end there. Please join us on Sunday as we celebrate Easter and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I want to thank you for joining us for this Good Friday presentation. God bless you.